My mom said phone addiction is real, and my 30 minutes a day wasn't enough to save us. The timer on the kitchen counter started beeping at exactly 4 p.m. like it did every single day, and I grabbed my phone from the lockbox on top of the refrigerator where Mom kept it during all the other hours. 30 minutes. That's all I got. 30 minutes to text my friends, check my messages, do my homework that required internet, and exist in the same world as every other teenager. Mom sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and opened her book, but I knew she wasn't really reading. She was watching me out of the corner of her eye like she always did, making sure I wasn't wasting my precious phone time on anything she deemed frivolous. It started 2 years ago when I was 14, and Mom read some article about how smartphones were destroying teenagers' brains and creating a generation of addicts. She came home from work that day with this manic energy, talking about dopamine hits and attention spans and how kids couldn't have real conversations anymore. Dad tried to calm her down, suggesting maybe we could just have some reasonable limits, but Mom was already spiraling into full panic mode. By the end of that week, she'd instituted the 30-minute rule, 1/2 hour per day, between 4 and 4:30 p.m., supervised in the kitchen. No exceptions. My little brother Theo was only 10 when the rule started, so he didn't fight it as much as I did. He'd just accepted that this was how our family worked, that other kids got to have phones whenever they wanted, but we didn't because Mom knew better. I fought it constantly at first. I'd argue about homework assignments that needed research, about group projects where my teammates couldn't reach me, about normal teenage social life that happened after 4:30 p.m. Mom had an answer for everything. Use the family computer for homework with her standing over my shoulder, tell my group project partners to email me, and I'd respond during my 30 minutes. Real friendships didn't require constant digital communication. The worst part was that Dad went along with it. He'd initially seemed skeptical about Mom's extreme approach, but within a few weeks he was backing her up completely, talking about how he'd survived just fine without a cell phone as a teenager. When I pointed out that was 30 years ago and the entire world had changed, he'd just shrug and say, "Times change, but principles don't." Gradually, I learned to stop fighting. It never worked anyway, and arguing just made Mom extend the supervision period or add new restrictions. At school, I became known as the girl with the crazy strict mom. Friends would text me and get no response until 4 p.m. the next day, when I could finally check my messages during my allotted time. People stopped inviting me to things because they knew I wouldn't see the invitation until it was too late. My best friend Kira tried to maintain our friendship for the first year, but eventually even she got tired of the one-sided communication where I could never respond in real time to anything. I watched my social life shrink to almost nothing while Mom congratulated herself on protecting me from phone addiction. The summer I turned 15, things got worse. Mom decided 30 minutes was still too much exposure to the digital world, so she cut it down to 20 minutes. When I protested, she said I should be grateful I got any phone time at all, that she was being generous by not taking it away completely. She started setting the timer for exactly 20 minutes, and if I even glanced at my phone after the timer went off, she'd confiscate it for 3 days as punishment. I learned to watch the clock obsessively, to cram everything I needed to do into those 20 minutes, to type faster than I ever thought possible. Dad's behavior started changing around that time too, getting more secretive and withdrawn. He'd always been quiet, but now he barely spoke at dinner. He started working later hours, coming home after Theo and I had gone to bed. When he was home, he'd disappear into the garage for hours, claiming he was organizing his tools or working on projects. Mom seemed relieved to have him out of her hair, and she never questioned why he suddenly needed so much alone time. I noticed but didn't think much of it beyond being glad that his absence meant less unified parental front against me. Then Mom found the article about electromagnetic fields and how phones gave off radiation that could cause cancer, and everything escalated to a new level of insane. She bought an EMF meter and walked around the house measuring radiation levels from every device. Our Wi-Fi router got unplugged and stored in the garage. The microwave was banned from use, and my phone time got cut again, this time down to 15 minutes because Mom said even that limited exposure was dangerous, but she recognized I needed some connectivity for emergencies. When I asked what emergency could possibly be communicated in 15 minutes, she said that's all anyone should need to call for help. School became impossible. I was failing classes because I couldn't complete online assignments in 15 minutes a day. Teachers were emailing my parents expressing concern, but Mom would respond with long manifestos about how schools needed to reduce their reliance on technology and provide alternative assignment options. Some teachers tried to work with me, printing out physical copies of readings or letting me use the library computers during lunch, but most just marked me down for missing work and moved on. My GPA dropped from a 3.8 to a 2.4 in a single semester. Kira stopped talking to me entirely after I missed her birthday party because I didn't see the invitation until 2 days later. I tried to explain about the phone restrictions, but she said I could have checked social media during my 15 minutes if I really cared. She wasn't wrong. I'd had to choose between responding to group chat messages, checking homework assignments, and seeing party invitations, and I'd made the wrong choice. The isolation was crushing. I spent lunches in the library alone, went straight home after school, existed in this bubble where the outside world moved at normal speed, but I was stuck in slow motion. Theo started having problems at school around the same time. His teacher called to say he was getting into fights during recess, that he seemed angry and aggressive in ways he'd never been before. Mom blamed it on the other kids being bad influences, on the school not disciplining properly. She pulled him out and started homeschooling him, which really meant he sat at the kitchen table doing workbooks while Mom hovered and controlled every minute of his day. He stopped having any friends at all. The few kids from his old class who tried to stay in touch gave up when they could never reach him. Dad's late nights became later and later until sometimes he didn't come home at all. Mom said he was working double shifts to save up for a family vacation, but I'd heard them fighting in their bedroom late at night when they thought we were asleep. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Something was very wrong. During my 15 minutes one day, I checked our family cell phone account online and saw that Dad had been texting someone constantly, hundreds of messages a day. I didn't recognize the number. I took screenshots but had no idea what to do with them. The real problem started when Dad stopped coming home entirely. He left on what was supposed to be a work trip and just never came back. Mom waited 3 days before saying anything to us, and when she finally told Theo and me that Dad had decided to take some time away from the family, her voice was flat and emotionless. She wouldn't give us details. She wouldn't let us call him. She said we needed to respect his space and focus on our own family unit. The phone restrictions got even tighter. Now I got 10 minutes a day, and Theo got 5 minutes twice a week to play educational games only. I tried to use my 10 minutes to search for information about Dad, to see if he'd posted anything on social media or if anyone knew where he was. But Mom had installed monitoring software on my phone without telling me, and she saw what I was searching for. That night, she took my phone away completely. She said I was using my limited phone time to be disrespectful and invade Dad's privacy, and until I could use technology responsibly, I didn't deserve access to it at all. I asked how I was supposed to contact anyone in an emergency, and she said that's what she was for. I was her child, and she would protect me. The next few weeks were the most isolated I'd ever felt. No phone, no computer access, no contact with the outside world except for school, which I was now failing out of completely. Teachers tried to reach my parents, but Mom had blocked the school's number on her phone, claiming they were harassing her about her parenting choices. The school counselor called CPS, but when the social worker visited, Mom had everything looking perfect. Clean house, full refrigerator. Theo and I were told to smile and say everything was fine. We did, because we'd learned by then that speaking up only made things worse. What I didn't know was that Dad was living with his girlfriend in an apartment across town, and he'd been documenting everything. The phone restrictions, the isolation, the failing grades, Mom's increasingly erratic behavior. He'd felt trapped in the marriage and had made the cowardly choice to leave instead of fighting for custody, but guilt was eating at him. He finally filed for divorce and included a custody request with detailed documentation of Mom's behavior. That's when everything exploded. Mom got served with divorce papers at the house while Theo and I were doing homework at the kitchen table. She opened the envelope and read through the documents, and her face went completely white, then red. Then she started screaming about betrayal and lies, about how Dad had abandoned his family and was trying to turn everyone against her. She called Dad's phone over and over, leaving increasingly unhinged voice messages about what a terrible father he was. I sat frozen at the table, terrified to move or speak. Theo started crying silently, tears running down his face while he kept his eyes on his math workbook. The custody evaluation process started a week later. A court-appointed psychologist came to interview all of us separately. When she talked to me, I told her everything. The phone restrictions, the isolation, the failing grades, the electromagnetic field paranoia, Mom's complete control over every aspect of our lives. The psychologist listened carefully and took detailed notes. She asked if I felt safe at home, and I realized I didn't know how to answer that question. Mom had never hit us or screamed at us or done anything obviously abusive. She just controlled everything until we couldn't function in the normal world anymore. When the psychologist interviewed Theo, he barely spoke. He'd been so isolated for so long that he didn't know how to talk to strangers anymore. He gave one-word answers and kept looking at the door like he was afraid Mom would walk in. The psychologist noted his anxiety and recommended a follow-up evaluation. Mom was furious about the whole process, claiming it was an invasion of privacy orchestrated by Dad to make her look bad. She refused to cooperate with several of the evaluation requirements and got reprimanded by the judge. The temporary custody order gave Dad supervised visitation every other weekend while the evaluation continued. The first weekend Theo and I spent at Dad's new apartment was surreal. He had Wi-Fi. He let us use devices without time limits. He had food we were allowed to eat whenever we wanted instead of scheduled meal times. He kept apologizing and saying he should have fought sooner, that he'd been a coward to leave us with Mom. I wanted to be angry at him for abandoning us, but mostly I was just relieved to be somewhere normal for 48 hours. Mom's behavior deteriorated rapidly after that first visitation. She became obsessed with documenting every tiny thing we did wrong, keeping detailed logs of our screen time violations and disrespectful behavior. Except she was making most of it up. She'd write that I spent 2 hours on my phone when I hadn't touched it at all. She'd claim Theo had been caught playing violent video games when he'd been reading a book. She was creating a fictional record to present to the court, and there was nothing we could do about it. The school reached out to the court-appointed psychologist directly after I failed another semester completely. My guidance counselor testified that I was a bright student who had been thriving academically until the phone restrictions made it impossible to complete work. She provided emails from teachers, missing assignment reports, everything documenting how Mom's rules had destroyed my education. The psychologist included all of it in her report. She also noted Mom's refusal to acknowledge how her restrictions were harming us, her inability to compromise, and her increasingly paranoid beliefs about technology. Then something happened that changed everything. Theo's teacher from his old school called CPS again, because she'd run into him at the grocery store and was shocked by how withdrawn and anxious he seemed. She reported that he'd flinched when she said hello, that he looked thinner than she remembered, that something was clearly very wrong. CPS had to follow up on the second report, and this time they took it more seriously. They showed up unannounced and found Theo sitting alone at the kitchen table doing workbooks while Mom was in her bedroom with the door locked, talking to herself. The CPS investigator tried to interview Mom, but she refused to come out of her bedroom. She yelled through the door about government overreach and parental rights, and how everyone was conspiring against her. The investigator decided this met the threshold for emergency intervention and called for backup. They removed Theo and me from the house that day while Mom screamed about kidnapping and illegal seizure. We were placed in emergency foster care with a family across town while the investigation continued. The foster home was normal in ways that felt almost bizarre after years with Mom. The foster parents, Linda and James, had 3 other kids and ran their household with reasonable rules and normal expectations. We could use phones and computers with basic supervision. We ate dinner together and talked about our days. We were expected to do chores and homework, but also had free time. It was like landing on a different planet where everything made sense and nobody was trying to control every second of your existence. Dad filed for emergency custody as soon as he found out we'd been removed. The court held a hearing within 72 hours, which was when I finally understood how bad things had gotten. The psychologist presented her evaluation, which included diagnoses Mom had never shared with anyone. She had severe anxiety and possible OCD that had gone untreated for years. Her obsession with phone addiction and electromagnetic fields was a manifestation of her mental illness, not rational parenting. She needed treatment, not custody of children. The judge reviewed all the evidence, the school reports, the CPS investigation, the psychologist's evaluation, and my testimony. When it was my turn to speak, I told the judge everything. I described the shrinking phone time, the isolation, the failing grades, the monitoring, the complete inability to have a normal teenage life or ask for help. I told her about watching Theo withdraw into himself, about Dad leaving and Mom spiraling, about feeling trapped with no way out. The judge listened carefully and asked clarifying questions, and I could see her expression shift from skeptical to concerned to angry as the full picture emerged. Mom represented herself at the hearing because she'd fired 2 lawyers who tried to get her to compromise. She gave a long, rambling statement about protecting her children from the dangers of technology, about how the modern world was poisoning kids' brains, about how she was the only one who really cared about our well-being. She presented her fabricated logs as evidence of our behavioral problems. The judge stopped her multiple times to point out inconsistencies and asked her directly why she thought it was appropriate to cut off her children from necessary educational tools and social support. Mom's answer was the thing that sealed her fate. She said, "Children don't get to decide what's best for them. Parental authority is absolute." The judge's face hardened, and she made notes. After Mom finished her statement, the judge announced that she was granting Dad temporary full custody pending Mom's completion of a psychological evaluation and parenting classes. Mom would have supervised visitation only, 2 hours a week at a facility, until she could demonstrate appropriate parenting. Mom started screaming about bias and corruption, and the bailiff had to escort her from the courtroom while she yelled about appealing. Moving in with Dad meant adjusting to yet another new living situation, but at least this one came with actual stability. Dad had a 3-bedroom apartment, so Theo and I each got our own room. He enrolled us in therapy to deal with the trauma of Mom's control and the family breakdown. He apologized constantly for leaving us, for not fighting sooner, for being too afraid of Mom to protect us when we needed it. I was still angry at him for abandoning us, but I was also grateful to finally be somewhere safe. School was a disaster that took months to repair. I had to retake most of my sophomore year classes and attend summer school to catch up. Teachers were understanding once they knew the full story, and my guidance counselor helped me create a recovery plan. By senior year, I'd brought my GPA back up to a 3.2, which wasn't what it had been before, but was honestly better than I'd expected given everything. I applied to colleges and wrote my essay about overcoming isolation and fighting for normalcy, and several schools seemed genuinely moved by my story. Theo struggled more than I did with the transition. He'd been younger when the isolation started, and it had damaged his social development in ways that were harder to fix. He couldn't make friends easily and had panic attacks in crowded spaces. Dad got him into intensive therapy with a specialist in childhood trauma. Slowly, over the course of a year, Theo started to come out of his shell. He joined a gaming club at school and made a few friends who accepted his quirks and anxiety. Watching him laugh at someone's joke for the first time in years made me cry in relief. Mom's supervised visitations were uncomfortable and strange. She'd sit across from us at the visitation center and try to have normal conversations, but everything felt forced and artificial. She never apologized for the phone restrictions or acknowledged how her behavior had hurt us. Instead, she'd talk about how much she missed us and how unfair the court system was. After a few months, Theo stopped going to visitations altogether because they gave him nightmares. I kept going out of some sense of obligation, but I'd stopped hoping Mom would ever really understand what she'd done. The final custody hearing happened a year after we'd been removed from Mom's house. Mom had completed some of the court-ordered services, but not all of them. Her psychological evaluation showed she'd been diagnosed with OCD and generalized anxiety disorder, and she was on medication that was helping. Her therapist testified that she'd made progress but still struggled to acknowledge how her behavior had harmed her children. The judge reviewed a year's worth of reports, supervised visitation logs, and testimony from everyone involved. I was 17 by then, and the judge asked what I wanted. I told her I wanted to stay with Dad, that I was finally stable and couldn't go back to the chaos of Mom's house. I said I was willing to maintain some contact with Mom, but only if she could respect boundaries and stop trying to control every aspect of my life. Theo, through his therapist, communicated that he wasn't ready for any contact with Mom beyond occasional supervised visits. The judge granted Dad permanent custody with a structured visitation plan for Mom that required her to continue treatment and respect the boundaries we set. Mom appealed the decision, but the appellate court upheld everything. She was allowed 2 supervised visits a month, which I attended sporadically, and Theo avoided completely. She kept insisting she'd done nothing wrong, that someday we'd understand she was trying to protect us. But the protection she'd offered had been suffocating isolation that nearly destroyed us both. 3 years after the custody change, I left for college with a full scholarship. Theo was thriving in high school with a small group of close friends and plans to study computer science. We'd both gotten our phones back, obviously, and learned to have healthy relationships with technology that Mom never could have understood. Dad and I had rebuilt our relationship enough that I could appreciate what he'd done right while still being honest about how badly he'd failed us initially. Mom sent occasional emails that I rarely responded to, and we maintained the bare minimum relationship required by the court order. The last time I saw Mom was at my college graduation. She showed up uninvited and sat in the back row, crying. I saw her afterward briefly, and she handed me a card with a long handwritten note about how proud she was and how she'd always just wanted what was best for me. I read it later and saw it was full of the same justifications and lack of accountability I'd heard for years. I put the card in a box with all the other painful reminders of that time and moved on with my life. 5 years after everything fell apart, I was working as a social media manager for a nonprofit and living in my own apartment across the state. Theo was finishing college and had a steady girlfriend who was patient with his anxiety. We talked regularly and had rebuilt our sibling relationship into something healthy. Dad had remarried someone kind who treated us like adults, and Mom was still living alone, still convinced she'd been right about everything, still unable to see how her desperate attempt to protect us from phone addiction had nearly destroyed our lives completely. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd built a career around the very technology she'd tried so hard to keep me away from, or that the 30 minutes a day she'd thought was generous had been nowhere near enough time for me to save myself or my brother from the isolation she'd created. We'd had to save ourselves, and it had taken years to recover from the damage.